But those progressive social policies are what led to the processes of political realignment among the two parties. Because as we were looking at the problems in the 60s, the liberals saw them in terms of social structural inequality and root causes that need to be addressed by governmental programs. And the conservatives saw all of these issues as just questions about individual responsibility. Bad people make bad choices, whether it's to get pregnant or to commit crimes or whatever it is, you know, you live with the consequences. The Republicans in 1968 seized the issues of crime, affirmative action, and welfare as wedge issues with which to woo white Southern voters. And the late 60s saw the processes of political realignment of Democrats and Republicans around the issues of race. In 1968, George Wallace ran in the Democratic primaries on a sort of a racial populism against liberalism and cultural elitism. And Nixon in '68 ran on a law and order campaign in which he was accusing the Warren Court of permissiveness and of, you know, handcuffing the police and liberating the forces of crime. And so it was really Nixon in 1968 who began what we now know as the Southern strategy, right? And that's the second half of this story, which is the South goes north. And what I'm really saying here, you know, not to put too fine a point on it, is Republicans have tasted race, and they find it very appealing as a form of political advantage. They use racially charged code words as a way of appealing to whites for political. See, now the room gets real quiet, you know. It's sort of, before people were sort of, well, I'm not gonna. Now, I mean, we're talking serious stuff here now. Part of it has been the inability of Democrats to respond to a lot of these issues of public policy because of their association with race. I mean, it's hard for Democrats to talk about crime or to talk about welfare or to talk about family values because they have lots of racial implications, and the black constituencies within the Democratic Party have made it difficult for them to talk about these sorts of issues. And so as we have seen racial polarization within our political discourse, we have also seen the emergence of the conservative frame and the emphasis of values like individualism and responsibility. And I mean, who can be against individualism and responsibility, except to the extent that they cause us to ignore the social structural determinants that enable people to make particular kinds of choices. Now, you know, when I give this talk, it's always with some trepidation because, you know, talking about race in American society is a very difficult sort of issue, and it's politically incorrect to talk about race. So I'm sorry for being so incorrect. So instead of talking about race, what we do is we talk in code. And talking in code enables us to indirectly implicate issues of race, but without really challenging egalitarian ideals. So when Trent Lott got up and said, you know, Strom Thurmond's the greatest thing since sliced bread and the whole world would be better off if we were still living in that segregated Jim Crow South, he got in trouble. Not because that's not what Republicans believe and say in their heart of hearts, but because he said it, because he made explicit what can only be said implicitly in political discourse. And so instead of saying to our white suburban voters, you know, we're going to get those black guys, we talk instead about, you know, we're going to crack down on crime and we're going to get tough and we're going to have a, you know, deal with youth crime. And race has really provided the focus for a whole host of political conflicts about values, about culture, about the allocation of resources. It's about tax policy, welfare policy, school policy, crime, drugs, family structure. It's about everything. And the media and the politicians for the past 3 decades have sensationalized these issues of crime and crime news coverage and crime policies for electoral advantage. In the 1970s, the Republicans gave us the war on crime. In the 1980s, they gave us the war on drugs. You know, some of you may remember 1988 when the older Bush ran all those Willie Horton ads, you know, showing this black male rapist as, you know, sort of the archetypal fear evoker for, you know, white suburbanites. And by the 1990s, juveniles had become the Willie Horton of American public policy. And our perception of these super predators, these demon youth, led to the changes in juvenile waiver policy and changes in juvenile court sentencing policy, and this fundamental shift from rehabilitation to retribution, and from an emphasis on offenders to the emphasis on offense, from concerns about amenability to treatment to issues of public safety and accountability. And all of these changes in waiver policy and in sentencing policy disproportionately affect black youths. Because to the extent that we're targeting violence and to the extent we're targeting drugs, we know they're going to have a disparate impact. And so what we've seen over the course of the last decade and a half has been this impetus to try more juveniles as adults. And, you know, sort of the politically sophisticated explanation for this is, you know, adult crime, adult time, or old enough to do the crime, old enough to do the time. I mean, that's a really sophisticated criminal sentencing policy. But it's important at a number of other levels as well, because by saying adult crime, adult time, I mean, we're really going through a process of culturally reconceptualizing adolescence, that children are no longer innocent and vulnerable, dependent, but now they're sort of this autonomous, fearful, almost adult-like, who require substantial repression. So that when we transfer these kids to criminal court, we sentence them just like adults, we sentence them to the same prisons as adults. You know, Kentucky has the dubious decision from Stanford of, you know, we execute them just like adults. I mean, actually, the Supreme Court's going to revisit that issue this coming year. But anyhow, we have to ask, you know, the U.S. is the only Western industrial nation in the world that eats its children. And that's all part of this crackdown on youth. We have the same problem. I'm going to sort of wrap it up here, right? Okay. You know, when we look at juvenile justice policies, we've got the same thing going on in the juvenile justice system. We're punishing kids. You know, it's sort of, I've been tracking state legislation and state codes and, you know, doing all of this stuff for the last, you know, 20 or 30 years, not realizing that I was living through and writing about, you know, each year, the transformation of the juvenile court as it became more punitive, as states in their juvenile codes, you know, started using words like punishment and accountability and responsibility instead of the best interests of the child, started adopting determinate sentencing laws or mandatory minimum sentencing laws. And when we look at the way judges sentence kids, there are two things that emerge when we empirically look at judges sentencing kids. The first is the offense is the most important factor that affects judges. Just like criminal courts, the emphasis on the present offense and the prior record. Because juvenile courts are ultimately just scaled down second-class criminal courts for kids, and so it's absolutely appropriate that they would reflect the values of the criminal justice system. But then the second phenomenon is that juvenile courts are more discretionary than the adult criminal justice system. And so racial disparities emerge after we control for present offense and prior record. And, you know, when I say juvenile courts are more discretionary than the adult system, it's because juvenile courts, from their progressive inception 100 years ago, were designed to discriminate. They were designed to distinguish between our children and other people's children.